It was a warm summer evening in 1977 when she vanished without a sound, no witnesses, no suspects, and no answers. For 43 years, her case sat frozen in time, a painful mystery that haunted investigators and shattered her family. But hidden deep within a single piece of clothing, a microscopic clue was waiting, a clue that would outlive everyone's doubts, defy decades of silence, and finally reveal the truth no one saw coming. The summer of 1977 wrapped the small town in a strange stillness. Warm winds drifted through empty streets, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. It was the kind of evening when doors were left unlocked and neighbors greeted each other from their porches. But beneath that peaceful surface, something unforgettable was about to happen. It began like any ordinary night, quiet, unassuming, and deceptively calm. She was last seen walking home after a local community gathering, her silhouette fading under the dim glow of the streetlights. Friends described her as cheerful that evening, laughing as she said her goodbyes. No one could have guessed that those would be the last moments anyone would ever see her alive. As she turned the corner onto the quiet lane leading to her house, the world around her seemed to fall silent. The neighborhood was modest. Rows of tidy homes, trimmed hedges, and white picket fences. Everyone knew each other's names, and strangers stood out immediately. It was precisely this familiarity that made her disappearance so terrifying. In a place where everyone felt safe, the idea that someone could vanish without a trace was almost impossible to believe. That night would soon shatter that illusion forever. As the evening deepened, her family expected to hear the familiar sound of the front door opening. Minutes turned into hours, and a growing unease crept into the house. Her mother peeked through the window again and again, convincing herself that she had simply lost track of time. But the clock on the wall ticked on relentlessly, each passing second tightening the knot of worry in their chests. By midnight, fear replaced hope. Her father drove through every street, retracing the path she usually took home. He stopped at corners, called out her name into the night, and questioned anyone still awake. The streets that once felt safe now seemed darker and unfamiliar. Shadows stretched across the pavement like silent watchers, and an unsettling chill clung to the summer air. The local police were notified shortly after, though at first, they believed it might be a misunderstanding. A young woman who perhaps decided to stay with a friend overnight, but her parents insisted this was out of character. She had never vanished without calling. The officers agreed to conduct a quick search, unaware that they were taking the first steps into what would become a decades-long mystery. Flashlights cut through the night as officers and neighbors formed small search groups. They combed nearby parks, alleyways, and wooded areas at the town's edge. Dogs barked as the sound of boots echoed against the quiet streets. People whispered theories, some too afraid to speak their darker thoughts aloud. For the first time, the town's comforting silence felt threatening. As dawn broke, tired searchers returned home empty-handed. The rising sun cast long shadows over the neighborhood, as if stretching out the fear that had settled overnight. Her family, exhausted and desperate, sat together in disbelief. How could someone disappear so completely in a place where everyone knew everyone? It didn't make sense, and that was the most frightening part. The police widened their search. Posters with her photo appeared on telephone poles, bulletin boards, and shop windows. Her face looked back at everyone, young, full of life, and now tragically missing. People who had seen her hours before were suddenly giving statements recounting every detail of that night. The smallest memory became precious, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Rumors began to swirl, as they often do in small towns. Some believed she had run away. Others whispered about a stranger's car spotted near the community center earlier that night. A few claimed they heard a scream, though none could say where it came from. The police tried to separate fact from speculation, but the lines blurred quickly under pressure and panic. Her disappearance unsettled everyone. Parents began walking their children to school again. Porch lights stayed on longer. Women no longer strolled home alone at night. The sense of innocence that once defined the town had cracked. People locked their doors for the first time in years, realizing that safety wasn't guaranteed even in a place they thought they understood. The investigators interviewed friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed her path that evening. Each conversation led to more questions than answers. There were no obvious enemies, no known grudges, no signs of a troubled personal life. She was simply there one moment and gone the next. That unsettling simplicity made the case even harder to grasp. A week later, search efforts were scaled back, but hope lingered stubbornly. Her family refused to give up. organizing volunteer groups and pleading for information. The community came together in vigils, holding candles and praying for her safe return. Yet beneath the unity was a shared fear that the truth would be far darker than anyone wanted to admit. Months passed, and leads dried up. Tips that once flooded the police station slowed to a trickle. The initial urgency faded into quiet frustration. Her room remained untouched. Photos on the wall, clothes in the closet, waiting for a return that never came. For the family, every unanswered question was a wound that refused to heal. That single night in 1977 became more than just the moment she vanished. It became the night the entire town changed. Trust was replaced with suspicion. Familiar streets felt different, carrying an invisible weight. No one could explain how she disappeared so completely. But one thing was certain: the quiet town would never be the same again. The investigation entered its most intense phase in the weeks following her disappearance. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, convinced that answers were hidden somewhere within the town's familiar streets. Every inch of her usual route was examined, from cracked sidewalks to overgrown hedges that lined the quieter paths. Detectives mapped her final known movements over and over, looking for patterns that simply weren't there. It was as if the trail evaporated the moment she turned that corner. Authorities brought in additional units from neighboring towns to strengthen the search. Dozens of officers combed through the wooded areas that bordered the community, their flashlights slicing through dense foliage. Dogs were deployed, their noses close to the ground, picking up faint scents that eventually faded into nothing. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights sweeping through open fields like restless eyes, but despite the scale of their efforts, no solid clue surfaced. Volunteers continued to flood in, neighbors, friends, even strangers from nearby cities who had read about the case in newspapers. They formed lines and walked shoulder to shoulder through fields and creek beds, determined not to miss a single detail. Hope and exhaustion intertwined as days stretched into nights. Every snapped twig or rustle of leaves sent hearts racing, but each moment of suspense ended in silence. The landscape seemed to hold its secrets tightly. Detectives began knocking on doors, one by one, questioning residents who lived anywhere along her route home. They asked about unusual cars, late-night noises, unfamiliar faces. Some recalled ordinary details. Others hesitated, unsure if their memories were reliable after the passing days. A few claimed to have seen a vehicle parked under a streetlight, but none could describe the driver clearly. Leads like these gave investigators temporary momentum, only to collapse under scrutiny. Search teams returned to the community center, the last confirmed place she had been seen. They carefully examined the building's exterior, checked storage rooms, and questioned staff once more. Nothing seemed out of place. It was a familiar location where people gathered for dances, meetings, and celebrations, a place that should have been safe. Yet somewhere between those walls and her front door, the truth had slipped through their fingers. The town's nearby river became a focus of attention. Divers entered the cold, murky waters, scanning the riverbed for any sign of evidence. The current was unpredictable, carrying debris downstream and making the search treacherous. Items were pulled from the water, examined, and dismissed one by one. Each new discovery brought a wave of anticipation that quickly dissolved into disappointment. The river, like the woods, offered no clear answers. Detectives then widened their scope, considering the possibility that she had been taken outside the town's limits. Highways and back roads were patrolled. Truck stops were checked and nearby towns were alerted. Flyers spread beyond the local community, appearing in gas stations, grocery stores, and post offices miles away. Still, no one came forward with meaningful information. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing but questions behind. The pressure on the investigative team grew. Journalists began covering the case extensively, publishing daily updates that alternated between hope and frustration. Headlines asked pointed questions. Where is she? Has the trail gone cold? Public scrutiny added urgency, but also frustration. As rumors became entangled with fact, detectives tried to keep control of the narrative, but the truth was, they were as bewildered as everyone else. One promising lead came when a witness reported seeing a suspicious man near the park on the night of her disappearance. Detectives followed up, interviewing the man extensively. His story was inconsistent at first, raising suspicions, but after days of questioning and verification, it turned out he had simply been walking home from work. Another potential breakthrough dissolved into another dead end, leaving investigators feeling the weight of time slipping away. As weeks turned into months, the search strategy shifted. What had begun as a widespread hunt narrowed into a slow, methodical review of evidence. Case files grew thicker with statements, maps, and photographs. Walls in the police station were covered with timelines and leads, red string connecting dates and names like a web. But no matter how many connections they tried to draw, the center of that web remained empty. The emotional toll on the search teams was undeniable. Officers who had once felt confident now stared at blank evidence boards late into the night. They questioned their own judgment, wondering if they had overlooked something obvious in those early crucial hours. Each unanswered lead felt like a personal failure. The case that had begun with urgency was slowly sinking into a chilling uncertainty. Local rumors grew darker as frustration spread. Some believed someone within the town itself was responsible and that the culprit was hiding in plain sight. Others speculated she had been abducted by someone passing through, someone who vanished as quickly as she did. Theories multiplied, but none brought investigators closer to the truth. Every possibility seemed both plausible and hollow at the same time. Search efforts eventually hit a wall. Without new evidence, the manpower dwindled. Volunteers had families to return to. Officers were reassigned, and the once bustling command post turned quiet. Her photo remained pinned to bulletin boards, staring back like a reminder of unfinished work. The lack of answers was more haunting than any discovery could have been. It was a mystery frozen in time. The family never stopped searching. While official efforts slowed, they organized their own drives, handing out flyers in distant towns and pleading for tips. They met with private investigators, followed anonymous letters, and chased rumors that led to abandoned houses and empty fields. Each time they returned with nothing, but their determination didn't waver. It became their mission to keep her story alive when official attention began to fade. Detectives, too, couldn't shake the case. Even as new crimes demanded their focus, this one lingered at the back of their minds. Evidence boxes were stored in dusty rooms, marked and labeled, but never forgotten. The lack of closure left a lingering sense of unfinished duty. The search had stretched across rivers, fields, highways, and hearts, but in the end it led nowhere. Years later, when the world moved on and the case grew cold, the maps were still there. The unanswered questions still echoed in the station halls. Everyone involved carried a shared frustration. They had searched everywhere a person could think to search, and yet the truth had remained hidden, waiting in silence for the moment science would finally catch up to it. As the years passed, the case slowly shifted from active investigation to an unsolved mystery buried in dusty archives. The bustling energy that once surrounded the search gave way to quiet resignation. Detectives who had once worked the case with urgency moved on to new assignments. Their desks cleared, but their memories unsettled. Her name, once spoken daily, became a faint echo in the corridors of the police station. The unanswered questions lingered like a weight that no one could set down. Her family refused to let her story fade, but the world around them began to change. Technology advanced, faces in the community grew older, and those who once remembered every detail began to move away or pass on. The once vivid accounts of that night turned into vague recollections. Neighbors who had once organized candlelight vigils now spoke about the case in hushed, distant tones. Time, it seemed, was slowly covering the mystery with a thin layer of dust. Detectives occasionally revisited the evidence, opening old boxes filled with photographs, notes, and items collected from the scene. Every object carried a sense of frozen urgency, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice what was missed. But each re-examination ended the same way, with frustration and silence. There were no new witnesses, no sudden confessions, and no miraculous discoveries. The trail remained as cold as the night she vanished. The passage of time also brought complications. Witnesses moved, memories faded, and leads that might have been promising decades earlier became impossible to verify. Places where evidence might have existed were demolished, repurposed, or overtaken by nature. The once familiar landmarks on the investigation maps were now changed beyond recognition. What had once been a living mystery was slowly becoming a historical puzzle, missing crucial pieces that might never be found again. For her parents, each passing year was a cruel reminder of unanswered prayers. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones were marked by an empty chair and a silent ache. They kept her belongings carefully preserved, clothes folded neatly, letters stored in boxes, photos kept framed and polished. Their home became a living time capsule, frozen in the hope that someday someone would walk through the door with the truth they had been waiting for. Generations grew up hearing fragments of the story. Local children whispered about the case like a ghost tale, pointing to the street where she was last seen as if it carried a supernatural presence. Teenagers dared each other to walk there at night, not fully understanding the real pain behind the legend. The case became part of the town's identity, a dark, unanswered chapter that every new resident eventually heard about. Detectives who had worked the case early in their careers sometimes returned in their later years, drawn back by the mystery that had never been solved. They flipped through the files with a mix of nostalgia and regret, seeing their younger handwriting in the margins. Many admitted that it was the one case they could never let go of. It was a reminder that even the most dedicated efforts could be defeated by silence and time. The evidence itself sat locked away in storage rooms, labeled with dates and case numbers that no longer felt immediate. Boxes lined metal shelves untouched for years, their contents carefully preserved but seldom examined. Inside were the key pieces: clothing, personal belongings, photographs, and notes, each holding the potential to unlock the truth, if only someone knew where to look. It was all there, waiting patiently for the right eyes to see what others had missed. Every so often, a new detective would inherit the case file, determined to be the one to solve what others couldn't. They would immerse themselves in the details, connecting names, places, and timelines like a massive, intricate puzzle. But eventually, frustration would set in as the lack of evidence and fading memories closed in. Enthusiasm gave way to the sobering reality that, without something new, the mystery was destined to remain unsolved. The town itself evolved, but the case remained anchored in 1977, untouched by the passing decades. New buildings rose, streets were renamed, and technology reshaped daily life. Yet her disappearance stayed frozen in its original form, immune to modern progress. It was like a photograph that never aged, the same unanswered story, staring back at each new generation with the same haunting intensity. For the family, the lack of resolution was a different kind of torment. Not knowing was worse than bad news. Every phone call from a detective brought a mix of dread and hope. Every anniversary reopened old wounds that never healed. The uncertainty became a permanent shadow over their lives, shaping their conversations, their decisions, and their sense of time itself. Decades passed, but emotionally they remained anchored to that night. Investigative technology slowly advanced, and whispers began to circulate about new forensic methods. DNA analysis was evolving into something powerful, capable of unlocking secrets long thought buried. But for years, the evidence remained untouched, waiting for resources, approvals, or simply the right moment. The case file was periodically reviewed, but no real movement occurred. It remained in limbo, not closed, not active, simply frozen. Cold case units were eventually formed to re-examine old mysteries, and her file found its way to a shelf among hundreds of others. Detectives specializing in forgotten stories would occasionally pick it up, intrigued by the eerie lack of leads. They recognized the unusual stillness surrounding the case. No suspects, no solid evidence trail, no clear motive. It stood out not because of what was found, but because of how little there was to work with. The passing decades also revealed how fragile memory can be. When detectives revisited original witnesses, many struggled to recall precise details. What was once a clear recollection had blurred into uncertain fragments. Some confused dates, others mixed events. It wasn't that they didn't care. Time had simply altered their ability to remember with clarity. The human mind, like physical evidence, can erode quietly over time. Despite the growing distance between the present and that fateful night, the case never fully disappeared. Local journalists occasionally revisited the story, publishing anniversary articles that reignited public interest. Each piece ended the same way, with lingering questions and fading hope. The mystery lived on, not through new evidence, but through its silence. It had become a ghostly presence in both the town's history and the family's heart. Somewhere, tucked away in a sealed evidence bag, lay the overlooked clue that would one day break everything open. For now, though, it waited in the dark, untouched by time, while the world moved on. The case was not forgotten, just waiting for the moment when technology and persistence would finally thaw the silence and reveal the truth that had been frozen for over 4 decades. Years of stalled investigation had left the case cold, but the evidence had never truly disappeared. Among the files and boxes in the police storage room sat a single item, a piece of clothing she had worn the night she vanished. For decades, it was treated as ordinary evidence, cataloged and stored, seemingly unremarkable. Yet in that quiet storage room, it carried a secret that time could not erase. Detectives had overlooked it in the rush of the initial investigation, focusing on eyewitnesses and potential suspects. They had examined it superficially, noting its condition and preserving it, but never imagined it might hold the key to unlocking the entire mystery. It was just a shirt, plain and unassuming, yet it had absorbed the last moments of her life in ways no one could see at the time. Forensic science had advanced while the shirt sat untouched. DNA analysis, in particular, had evolved into a highly precise tool capable of identifying even the smallest trace. What had once been impossible was now within reach. When the case was reopened decades later, a fresh pair of eyes recognized the potential of this single item. Suddenly, a thread appeared where there had been none. The shirt was carefully examined, fibers inspected, and stains analyzed with modern equipment. Forensic experts applied techniques that did not exist when she disappeared. Every speck of dust and tiny mark was scrutinized under powerful microscopes. It was a painstaking process, but slowly evidence began to emerge, something microscopic, barely visible, yet unmistakably significant. A trace of DNA was discovered, faint but undeniable. It did not belong to her. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigative team. This small clue, buried for decades, contained the identity of a person who had been in close proximity to her the night she vanished. The implications were staggering. What was once a blank canvas of uncertainty now had a definitive mark pointing toward the truth. Experts ran the sample through national DNA databases, seeking a match that could unlock years of unanswered questions. The analysis was painstaking, with hours spent comparing sequences and validating results. Each step increased anticipation and anxiety. Finally, the database returned a potential match, a lead that had the power to rewrite everything the investigators thought they knew. The discovery reignited the investigation with unparalleled intensity. Detectives revisited old notes, re-interviewed witnesses, and pieced together connections that had once seemed insignificant. Every detail was re-examined in light of this new evidence. Streets, parks, and corners she had passed that night were reconsidered. Suddenly, the timeline of events gained new clarity, revealing patterns that had been invisible for decades. Her family was informed immediately. After years of waiting, hope flickered once more in their hearts. The recognition that something tangible existed reignited emotions they had long buried. Tears, relief, and disbelief mingled as they realized the case was finally moving forward. For the first time in 43 years, a concrete breakthrough had arrived, and it came from the most unexpected place. The new lead allowed investigators to narrow their search significantly. Suspects previously dismissed were reconsidered. Locations once ruled out were visited again, this time with precision and purpose. Every prior dead end became a potential turning point when examined through the lens of the DNA evidence. What had once seemed impossible was suddenly within reach, all because of a single overlooked detail. Forensic teams also discovered secondary traces on the shirt, tiny fibers and residues that had been invisible with the older techniques. These traces connected the crime scene to a specific location outside the immediate town. A map of movements emerged, subtle and fragmented at first, then gradually more coherent. The evidence began to form a story that investigators could finally follow. Witnesses who had previously provided incomplete statements were re-interviewed. With the DNA breakthrough, their memories resurfaced with added clarity. Small details they had forgotten became crucial pieces of the puzzle. Every recollection was reevaluated, giving weight to clues that had been dismissed decades earlier. The pieces began to fit together like a pattern emerging from fog. The community, once resigned to a tragic mystery, now watched closely. News of the breakthrough spread, bringing renewed attention and hope. People who had long believed the case would never be solved began to feel a shift in reality. A decades-old story that had once seemed frozen in despair was now moving forward with momentum, driven entirely by one simple, overlooked clue. As investigators followed this new path, additional forensic tests were conducted. Blood analysis, microscopic residue, and chemical traces all contributed to a growing understanding of what had occurred. Each test confirmed the significance of the shirt, proving that this single piece of evidence was indeed pivotal. The once dormant case finally had direction, and that direction was unmistakably clear. The breakthrough also altered the psychological approach to the case. Detectives, who had spent years accepting uncertainty, now felt renewed purpose. They reviewed prior assumptions and considered the mindset of anyone involved in the disappearance. Patterns of behavior and motives became clearer, shedding light on actions that had previously seemed inexplicable. The shirt had done more than reveal a name. It reshaped the entire investigation. Ultimately, it was a reminder of how small, overlooked details can change everything. A single forgotten item, quietly preserved for decades, had rewritten the story of a young woman's disappearance. What had once been an unsolvable mystery now had a path to resolution. The case, frozen for so long, was finally thawed, showing that even the tiniest clue can carry the power to illuminate the darkest secrets. The moment the DNA match came back, the entire investigative team felt a surge of disbelief and anticipation. Decades of unanswered questions suddenly had a tangible direction. The match was not just a name in a database. It was the identity of someone who had been involved in her disappearance all those years ago. The silence that had haunted the case for decades was about to be broken in the most dramatic way possible. For the family, the news hit like a tidal wave of emotion. Relief, fear, and hope collided simultaneously. After 43 years, they finally had a name, a thread to cling to in the sea of uncertainty. Memories of her last night returned vividly, each detail magnified by the realization that justice might finally be possible. Their long, exhausting wait was now replaced by action and possibility. The investigators immediately began tracing the person identified by the DNA. Old records, previous arrests, and historical addresses were meticulously reviewed. Every connection, no matter how small, was mapped to create a timeline of movements and interactions. The goal was not just to identify the person, but to uncover the sequence of events that had led to her disappearance. The quiet town that had once seemed safe was about to reveal its darkest secrets. Law enforcement coordinated carefully, knowing that timing and precision were critical. The suspect had to be approached with caution, and all evidence had to be airtight. Years of legal protocols and investigative caution guided each step. Despite the urgency, officers maintained discipline, knowing that even one misstep could compromise decades of effort. Every decision carried enormous weight, as the breakthrough had opened the door to a potential resolution. DNA evidence also allowed investigators to link seemingly unrelated pieces of information. Objects, locations, and witness statements that had once been dismissed suddenly gained significance. A glove left near a park, a suspicious car reported years earlier, even subtle changes in behavior from old acquaintances, all of it could now be understood in a coherent narrative. The breakthrough illuminated the shadowy corners that had long concealed the truth. Forensic experts conducted additional tests on other items collected that night. Fibers, hairs, and microscopic traces were compared against the new DNA profile. The results were staggering. Multiple items confirmed the presence of the same individual, reinforcing the connection and providing irrefutable evidence. What had once been a cold, silent case was now alive with concrete scientific proof. The DNA breakthrough also prompted re-interviews with witnesses who had previously given incomplete statements. With a name to focus on, memories sharpened and details emerged that had been buried under decades of uncertainty. People recalled seeing that person in areas they hadn't realized were relevant. Every recollection added pieces to the puzzle, creating a clearer picture of the night she disappeared. News of the breakthrough quickly spread through the law enforcement community. Colleagues marveled at how a single overlooked item, combined with modern science, had shattered a decades-long silence. The case became a symbol of perseverance, patience, and the evolving power of forensic technology. What had been a cold case was now a model for how science could rewrite history and deliver long-awaited justice. Detectives reconstructed the timeline using the DNA evidence as a backbone. They mapped the movements of the suspect on the night in question, overlaying it with her known route. Every intersection, every turn, every encounter was re-examined under the new light. The once impenetrable web of uncertainty began to unravel, revealing a sequence of events that no one had fully understood before. The breakthrough also brought legal teams into the process, ensuring that the evidence was properly documented and admissible. They prepared for potential trials, knowing that decades of silence would soon be replaced by courtroom drama. Experts ensured that every chain of custody, every report, and every lab test was meticulously verified. The case was no longer a distant memory. It was active, tangible, and unstoppable. Her family, now armed with the knowledge of the DNA match, began to feel a cautious optimism. For years they had waited, hoping for a sign. Now not only did the sign exist, but it was irrefutable. They could finally envision the possibility of closure, a sense of justice, and a way to honor her memory. Emotions ran high, and even seasoned investigators noted the intensity of their reaction. The breakthrough also highlighted the fragility of time and memory. Had the shirt not been preserved, had the DNA technology not advanced, the case might never have been solved. it was a reminder that every piece of evidence, no matter how small or overlooked, can hold the key to the truth. What had once been an abandoned file became a beacon, proving the value of persistence and scientific innovation. Investigators coordinated with other agencies to confirm the identity of the suspect. Fingerprints, previous criminal records, and historical data were compared and verified. Each confirmation strengthened the case and eliminated doubts. The breakthrough was not just scientific, it was strategic, reinforcing the investigative process and ensuring that justice could be pursued confidently. Community members, long haunted by her disappearance, were stunned by the revelation. The breakthrough reopened conversations, rekindled interest, and brought closure to those who had silently followed the case for decades. The town that had been forever altered by her absence now witnessed the power of modern science in restoring truth to the surface. A sense of shared justice began to emerge among residents. Ultimately, the DNA breakthrough proved that silence can be shattered even decades later. One overlooked clue, patiently preserved, became the linchpin that redefined the entire investigation. The case, frozen for 43 years, had finally moved from uncertainty to resolution. It was a testament to persistence, technology, and the unwavering determination of those who refused to let her story fade. The moment the suspect was formally identified, a palpable sense of anticipation rippled through the investigation team. Decades of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and relentless searching were finally converging toward a resolution. Every piece of evidence, from the smallest fiber to the critical DNA match, became a cornerstone of the case. Justice, long delayed, was now within reach. The suspect's arrest was executed with careful planning and precision. Officers coordinated to ensure the individual was taken into custody without incident, knowing that decades of legal scrutiny would follow. Flashbulbs from reporters captured the moment. But behind the cameras, detectives felt the quiet satisfaction of persistence paying off. A case once thought unsolvable was finally active again, breathing new life into the pursuit of truth. For her family, the news was overwhelming. Emotions they had carried silently for more than 4 decades surged at once: relief, grief, hope, and vindication. They had waited for years, imagining the moment when someone would answer for the unimaginable pain of her disappearance. Now that moment had arrived, bringing a mixture of closure and sorrow as they faced the long-overdue reality. Court preparations began immediately, with legal teams meticulously reviewing every detail of the evidence. Prosecutors knew the case had to be airtight after so many years, leaving no room for doubt or challenge. They reconstructed the timeline, gathered testimonies, and prepared experts to explain the DNA breakthrough. Every step emphasized the meticulous effort required to convert decades of scientific discovery into courtroom justice. The community watched closely, decades of speculation and fear replaced by cautious optimism. People who had long whispered about her disappearance now waited to witness accountability. The quiet streets that once bore the weight of uncertainty felt alive with anticipation. For many, the resolution of this case symbolized more than just one missing person. It represented the triumph of patience, science, and justice over time itself. Witnesses who had previously provided statements were called upon again. Memories sharpened under scrutiny, and even the smallest details became crucial. Some recalled new observations when prompted with the evidence collected decades ago. Their testimonies, supported by forensic science, strengthened the case in ways that had once seemed impossible. The power of collective memory, combined with modern technology, had reshaped the narrative entirely. The trial, when it finally commenced, was a mixture of intense emotion and meticulous legal argument. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence with precision, showing how the long-forgotten clue had unraveled decades of silence. Defense teams tried to challenge the validity, but advancements in forensic science and detailed documentation left little room for dispute. The courtroom became a stage where decades of uncertainty were confronted with undeniable proof. Her story, once confined to whispers and files, became central to the legal proceedings. The journey from disappearance to discovery, from lost hope to renewed pursuit, was outlined for the court. Judges, jurors, and the public followed the evidence carefully, witnessing how one overlooked shirt could carry the weight of decades. Every fiber, stain, and trace was now a voice, speaking louder than any witness ever could. The suspect's confession, whether partial or full, provided critical insight into the events of that night. Details that had long been unknown came to light, filling in the gaps left by time. Motives, actions, and the sequence of events were finally understood. The silence that had haunted the investigation for over 40 years was shattered. replaced by a clear, indisputable narrative that accounted for every piece of evidence. Family members, now allowed to testify and participate, spoke with restrained emotion. Their words carried the weight of decades of grief and unanswered questions. They described the impact of her absence, the long years of searching, and the hope that had never fully vanished. Each statement reinforced the human cost of the crime, making the pursuit of justice feel profoundly personal and necessary. The verdict, when delivered, was a collective exhale of relief and closure. Accountability had been established, and the community felt a sense of moral balance restored. While nothing could return the years lost or erase the trauma, the legal system had finally spoken on behalf of a young woman whose voice had been silent for far too long. Justice had arrived, no longer delayed by the passage of time. News outlets covered the resolution extensively, highlighting the role of modern forensic science and persistent investigation. The story became an emblem of hope for other cold cases, proving that even decades-old mysteries could be solved. Communities, families, and law enforcement agencies were reminded of the power of perseverance, the importance of preserving evidence, and the eventual triumph of truth. Her disappearance, once a permanent scar on the town's memory, began to transform into a story of resilience and resolution. People who had lived under the shadow of uncertainty now saw an example of closure achieved. Neighborhoods slowly returned to their routines, but the lessons of vigilance, empathy, and justice endured. The case was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a narrative of courage, patience, and ultimate vindication. The family took time to memorialize her properly, creating a tribute that honored her life rather than her absence. Photographs, stories, and memories were shared publicly, turning decades of silence into a celebration of her existence. The closure allowed them to begin healing, acknowledging the past while cautiously moving toward the future. Her legacy, once overshadowed by mystery, was finally restored. Ultimately, this case proved that truth has no expiration date. Time may delay justice, silence may persist for decades, and hope may flicker, but the combination of perseverance, science, and human determination can break through even the longest darkness. 43 years later, the truth finally spoke, echoing through the community, the courtroom, and the hearts of all who had never stopped believing. For over 4 decades, her story was a question with no answer, a name fading deeper into old files and distant memories, but one silent trace refused to be forgotten. With the power of modern DNA, investigators uncovered what time tried to bury. Her truth finally rose to the surface, and with it, justice arrived, even if it took 43 years. Her case is a reminder that no matter how cold the trail may seem, the truth never disappears, it waits, and when it's found, it speaks louder than ever.